This week on the Eldritch Lorecast, a geyser of new miniatures from Wizkids spurns on a conversation about battle mats or theatre of the mind. All that and more now. Hello everybody and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, the #1 D&D and tabletop RPG podcast in the plains. Every dragon has every episode of the Eldritch Lorecast in their hoard. My name is Ben Byrne and I am here as always with Dael Kingsmill, James Hake, Shawn Merwin. Shawn, I've got to ask you, I think I asked a couple of weeks ago if you had a hobby, but are you a collector? Are you like a dragon hoarder? Do you have something specific that you have to have every one of?
I am the anti-collector at this point. I am giving away books, giving away games, deleting files from my computer. I don't know what it is. It's the anti-nesting phase of my life, I think. I only collect bad habits at this point because they're easy to get and you don't see them usually. So
yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I think there's definitely merit in sort of that minimalist, like have less things sort of lifestyle, especially when they're just things. Specifically, Dael Kingsmill, are you also an anti-collector or are you a collector?
I'm trying to think because it's not like I don't collect things. If I am a collector, I'm bad at it. And if I am an anti-collector, I'm also bad at it. You know what I mean? Like I have a lot of Magic the Gathering cards, but no, I wouldn't say it's a good collection.
Sure.
I have a lot of DVDs. I wouldn't say it's a good collection. I have some stamps I started collecting once upon a time when I was a child that I never got rid of, but it's also not a good collection. I think if anything, when I was a kid, I used collecting as a phrase to excuse some hoarding tendencies that I have slowly tried to shake off. I collect jackets. Does that count? I have a lot of jackets.
Yeah, there you go. That's a collection of jackets, your dragon hoard of jackets. It'd be a comfortable hoard to sleep upon. James Hake, what is it that you collect, if anything, or anti-collect?
Well, if my therapist is to be believed, coping mechanisms.
I don't know whether to laugh at that.
I'll laugh.
I'm sure I've talked about my houseplant collection, of course. It's up to 28 in this home, which surprised me a little bit. I could have sworn it was under 20, getting a bit out of control. But, you know, I think the thing that I mean, literally they are. I'll just snip one off and suddenly it's got roots and it keeps going. If there's like a collectible thing that I collect, then I'm very much in the same camp as Dael. I'm not really a very good collector, but I do have a lot of D&D minis, a lot of Wizkids pre-painted plastic minis, which the collection has grown over quarantine, which is silly because I think I've used my minis maybe twice in the past, like 2.5 years. But they're just off screen. The 5 adult chromatic dragons that Wizkids came out with, I have collected those quite ravenously as they've been releasing.
Yeah, miniatures are my collector's Achilles heel as well. I have bundles of like aftermarket Kickstarters, like Massive Darkness, which had like a whole horde of miniatures, and Mythic Battles Pantheon had a massive horde of miniatures with it as well. And then getting into wargaming, and my partner was like, do you need more? You haven't painted any of these. And I was like, no, I have a strict 15-85% rule, which is 15% of it is painted, and once that I get up to that ratio, I can buy more. So that's I have minis I know I will never get around to painting anymore now. I'm like, nah, this thing's never getting paint on it. But as long as it sees the table.
I really thought the 1585 was the other way around.
No, everybody knows. Everybody knows. I'm at least in the position where I tend not to buy new miniatures unless I know I'm going to paint them. But even that gets out of control very, very quickly, where I'm like, yeah, I'll paint this. And it's been 3 months and I'm like, oh no, another one on the pile. Speaking of collecting things and dragon hordes, a little bit of Ghostfire gaming news this week. Next week is the launch of the Arora Age of Desolation Kickstarter, which is launching next Monday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Or is it Eastern Daylight Time at the moment? Either way, 10 a.m. East Coast. It is launching next Monday. Shawn, are you excited for this launch?
I am as excited as I get, yes. I am between trying to be chill about it and just absolutely terrified all at the same time.
Like, are you a Kickstarter veteran at this point where it leads up to one of your babies being thrust out into the limelight in that way?
This is probably the first one that I would consider my project.
Sure.
Even with the grimoire, I let it, but this was something that I've been wanting to do for years and never had the resources to do it. When I went into freelance mode, I thought, well, maybe I will earn enough and I will hire artists and I will do this. And then being hired by Ghostfire gave me the perfect opportunity with a cast of thousands or a cast of a dozen really, really smart, talented folks who could offer the support that a Kickstarter of this magnitude needs. So I am looking forward to this vision actually becoming reality. And it's exciting and thrilling and terrifying all at the same time.
We're being a little coy this week just because we don't want to give too much away from the Kickstarter itself, although details have been dribbling out of dribbling, that's a visual for you.
Yeah, that was a good choice of words.
Trickling out of the Ghostfire Gaming Twitter.
You corrupted it already. You can't come back from dribbling.
Yeah, okay. It's like it's like a green dragon dribbles poison or a black dragon dribbles acid. There you go.
Right.
That was the analogy I was going for.
I'll
Like
give
a 7
it to
foot
you,
tall
I
man
guess.
dribbles a basketball. There
you go. We're doing a live stream next week, which will be 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Monday, where we will reveal everything that needs to be revealed about the Kickstarter. At that point, we'll also have Phil from Ghostfire Gaming on there as well. So looking forward to doing that with Shawn. So stay tuned, because next week, all the details, there will no longer be a dribble. It will be a full geyser of something. I don't know. Anyway, speaking of geysers, in the week in between, I'm on fire today. In the week in between, there has been announcements of a geyser of miniatures coming from Wizkids. There you go.
I don't know why I thought that the geyser metaphor would be relevant somehow. I really had that
Of course it's
hope.
relevant. It's like the Rick and Morty episode
Geyser
where...
of miniatures.
Yeah, they're just like coming out of a hole in the ground and just shooting up in the air, and then you got to catch them in a basket as they come raining down.
I think I played that game in Mario Party.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly.
Where do miniatures come from? Well,
Molten plastic just shooting out in all directions.
they hold out the molds, just catch them. Ah.
Yep, exactly. Got to catch them all.
Famously where that phrase comes from.
After they have been caught from their geyser of molten plastic, they get pressed and pre-painted in the guise of the pre-painted Spelljammer minis, which are coming from Wizkids. They showed off a bunch of those. There's the unpainted Critical Role mini series, which is continuing, and also a painted Bell's Hells miniature collection of the party, which is coming in fall/spring if you're in Australia. So September-ish I have written, but the month hasn't been given. Anyway, whole geyser of miniatures coming through. You mentioned just before, James, you have a bunch of minis. Is miniatures your thing? Before you were forced to play remotely, were you using them a lot at your table or not really?
Oh, I love to use miniatures at the table. This might come from my strategy video game background, but I love tactical battle maps. And miniatures on them. Honestly, even in quarantine, I use virtual tabletops all the time. And it gives me an opportunity to use some of the beautiful maps that map makers I'm subscribed to on Patreon come out with, which is wonderful. Making maps is honestly my least favorite part of it. It sounds sacrilegious for me to say that because I love making maps. But when the time comes to make a battle map on the fly in the middle of a game, and I'm like frantic, like scribble it out, don't hang up the game for half an hour being an artiste about it. I don't like that part of the D&D game. I love the part where the characters are using interesting terrain and being tactical. So if I'm very smart, I'll have gone to FedEx and printed out a poster-sized Dice and Logos map or something like that. But virtual tabletops let me do it much better. But I don't get minis. I don't get the tactile joy of dropping a mini on the table and moving them around and stuff when I play virtual. So there's benefits and drawbacks to both, I've found.
Yeah, I love the miniatures. I love the tactical tabletop. Coming from wargaming, it's kind of my jive. I don't collect dice, I collect miniatures. But I agree with you. There's kind of like a weird flip with going on to virtual tabletops where if I'm playing in person, I love the wet erase mats because it's like this could be literally anything. I'm not like a huge fan of 3D terrain because that 3D terrain can only be that thing, even if it's modular, you might not quite have enough walls to kind of make the size of the room or whatever you want to make. Whereas if it's wet erase, you just scribble it down, don't be an artiste about it, like you said, and just, here are the basic shapes. This is difficult terrain over here. Here's some water. Let's do this. If I'm doing virtual tabletops, because there's so much detail in them, I can lose hours, constructing these intricate maps. And I remember I was making a wizard's tower once and I was like, well, the wizard's got to have somewhere to sleep. And of course they're going to have a bedside table and they're going to need a candle on top of their bedside table for reading. And they're going to need their scrolls on top of that. And my partner's like, what are you doing? You've been on this for hours. I'm like, well, I need to make sure that this is, a properly outfitted wizard's table.
Don't come after me like this.
Right? There's definitely a lot of fun to be had with the virtual tabletop stuff. Dael, are you battle maps, miniatures kind of person, or you prefer theater of the mind?
I think my philosophy when it comes to minis is usually like, what does my brother have in his his old Warhammer Fantasy collection? Or It's like, I know that he got that kickstarted Dark Souls board game. What big scary monsters did that come with? It's like, does this fit? Can I make it fit? I'll use lizard folk more often than maybe other tables do because he had a lizard man army. That's kind of my approach. I'm not a big mini person. I have a bunch of minis. Okay, anyone who collects miniatures at home listening to this, I need you to modify what you think I mean when I say a bunch of minis. Let's maybe change that to like a handful.
Okay, sure.
But they're all kind of still in their boxes. And I like them, but I don't, I don't pull them out and use them. But I think I'm closer to being a mini using person than a theater of the mind person, but my players are definitely more theater of the mind people. So I don't know, I'm in a strange limbo, floating between all of it. Not really happy with any of it.
If you're running a game, is there a decision that gets made when you say roll for initiative, just before or just after, in terms of whether you are going to crack out the battle grid and the D4s as miniatures if don't have minis on hand, and just doing it theater of the mind? Like, is there a flip, or are you always one way or the other?
Well, I do tend to have with me, I have the Pathfinder NPC boxes that come with just a bunch of 2D standees. So I have those on hand if
Okay, yep.
All
cool.
right. Okay, I don't need your judgment. Okay, the art's really good, but
Yeah, they're great.
Yeah, I'm sure that you feel that in your heart.
No, they're awesome.
Very believable. You have an acting background. Do better. But I have them on hand if I am kind of throwing something together last minute. But for the most part, I've started, at least with my regular group, I've started doing a thing where we just go into it, theater of the mind, but I have a map on my side of the DM screen so that I can kind of keep track of, distances and things like that and just, tell them as they need to know. And there's usually a point during the combat where they say, wait, I'm confused, who's where? And I can just lift up the screen and show them the map and then put it back down again. Because I don't know what it is. My players don't respond as well to combat if they can see the minis at all times. They don't. I think there's something they find distracting about it. I'm sure not all of them, but at least 3.
There is, I had to train my players not to expect combat if I drew out a map on the grid, right? If I'm just drawing it out to give them a representation of what they're seeing. So it's not like, oh, there's a door kind of over here and there's another door over there and this door has stairs that go down and they're like, wait, which door has what? You draw it out so that, they get that real visualization. But I had to train them that this doesn't
that
mean
does
there's
not
a
mean
combat.
combat.
Yeah, exactly. Not automatic. I mean, look, it might mean combat. You could do combat if you want to, but don't be like, all right, it's fight time. Let's do this. And everybody strikes a pose. Shawn, do you have a preference one way or the other?
I usually try to do what best serves the game. First and second edition, when I played games, never used battle maps, never used minis. We might have to sketch something out if people had questions, but that was it. When I started running third edition, I was running a lot of game conventions where you have 2 hours or 4 hours or 1 hour to get people through an adventure. Having a battle map ready to go, sitting it down, you don't have to answer as many questions then. What does the room look like? You can pull a mini out and say, this is what you see, rather than having to describe the monster. So I used it as a tool for that situation. For 5th edition, I try to do both. I try to do theater of the mind to keep things moving quickly. Then when we have a complex battle with maybe some terrain that comes into play or some props that, there's a ballista in the corner. Well, we know that somebody's going to be using that ballista, so we want to represent that somehow. Then we pull out the map and draw it out beforehand if we can, draw it out during the game if it's my home game and we're just sort of playing along.
As I know we're majoritively forever, in quotation marks, GMs, or my understanding is that is the case, but do we have a preference as players? Like, is there a difference as a player when that miniature gets placed on the table? I mean, instead of using the miniature to describe the monster, often what I'll do is give a really detailed description to the monster and then be like, and here it is, and hoping that has a bit of an impact to it, that the players go, oh, there it is. All right, this thing's real. Let's fight it. Let's go. Do we feel there's a tangible difference to having that miniature there, or not really?
Yes. I absolutely find my focus tighten when I have a map and a miniature in front of me. I'm just naturally a little ADHD, a little bit scattered. If I, zone out during another player's turn, or I get so laser focused in on, okay, what's my next turn going to be, I'll often miss things that just kind of go by for, half a round of combat. And if there's no maps and minis out in front of me, I'll often start my turn thinking, is it worth slowing down combat for me to ask the DM to quickly catch me up on what's going on? But if there's a visual representation right in front of me, and I'm a pretty visual person, I can just be like, okay, that guy, that's me. All right, we're great to go.
I agree. I really find that I don't know whether it's because I play more video games than my players tend to on the whole, but I do like being able to see the terrain. I like counting squares. I like looking for groups of bad guys that I can target. Any number of those weird little strategic things that happen in combat and nowhere else for D&D. But that's not fair. But I mean those specific combat strategy elements like movement speed. But I don't know whether it's specifically about the minis. Maybe I just haven't been a player enough in games that use minis. But I don't know, at least in terms of minis that represent characters, I frequently find it very frustrating not being able to find a miniature that, like, I feel properly represents my character.
Yeah.
And so then you go to the Hero Forge and you're like, do I drop this much money on a mini that I will never paint for a game that could fizzle out in 2 weeks' time? Do I do it? Do I dare disturb the universe?
I've had players.
It's like you're tempting fate at that point, really.
Yeah. I've had players, they order their Hero Forge mini, they arrive in the mail, 2 weeks later the player character gets killed. Like it's a frustrating feeling, I imagine, for players as well.
Whereas if you have the Pathfinder NPC box, you can find any number of characters to represent your hero.
Paizo, will you sponsor us? Please, Paizo, please.
That is the frustrating thing on the DM side of that is, monsters are only ever really on the table as miniatures for an hour, maybe, if it takes that long for the combat to go through, especially if it's like a feature monster. Unless it's something like a zombie or a goblin or some sort of minion monster that is going to come out again and again and again. I spent a couple hours painting up this frog monster over the last couple of weekends. I posted a picture of it on my Twitter account, but it went on the table and I was like, here's this monster. And then an hour later it was dead. And I'm like, it goes back in the box forever now. Like, goodbye. Goodbye,
I suppose
monster.
that's the question, right, that I have for all of you. Is do you think up a thing that you want to do, like a combat you want to have, and then try and find a midi for it? Or do you look at your collection of midis and go, how can I use these?
Little column A, little column B. Yeah. Balance is the key.
My minis are in a box somewhere that I haven't given away already. So no, it's totally I've had commissions to write things where they're like, we want you to use these 12 minis, and in that sense, or we have this battle map that we want you to use. And that's a great way to to spur on your creativity. We don't want to spurn our creativity. Your T.S. Eliot reference has thrown me, Dael. Now I'm going to be forever looking. That's okay. April is the cruelest month there. So anyway, for me, whether a mini adds to the game or not depends on what the DM's style is. If I have a DM that can tell a great story using the character's actions and is constantly but quickly setting the next scene, the wizard just cast a fireball. Here's what happens. Here's what it looks like now. Move on. Then I love that without having to have it all played out on a battle map, because it can go faster if the game master has the penchant for setting those scenes and telling those stories. If the game master is not as adept at that, then that sort of miniature map terrain element is so essential to keep the game on track. As James said, then players don't have to keep asking what's happening. But I also like the flow of Theater of the Mind games that where players aren't worried about where everyone's standing. The wizard can just say, I cast the fireball and I place it so I don't hit my friends. And then the game master can say, all right, you get 3. Or, I always love this one as a game master. Roll a d4. That's how many players you can get, or monsters you can get. Roll 2d4.
Unless.
If you want, but then you get the fighter who's right up there as well.
Right.
And that adds a little, it's not part of the game, obviously, the rules as written, but it adds a little fun to the game. And then the players can talk to each other. Yeah, well, I've got many hit points, says the fighter's player. So go ahead and do that. Get some extra enemies. Oh, I failed my saving throw. Wait, you maximized it? What? Oh, well, and that, that's where some of the fun, as long as the players are, telling the story together, can have some great stories come from that.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose if you're not using miniatures, you do need to abstract like spatial awareness a little bit more to, especially like I'm thinking of spike growth, or a spell that has a large area of effect that sits kind of where it is. And so kind of figuring out, have they run into it? How far are they off the edge of the spike growth? How close is the, ranger or the monk or the rogue, let's say, who ran up, stabbed, and then ran back using disengage? Are they on the edge of the spike growth? Are they in the spike growth? And so abstracting that out, I find a bit of a challenge without using the grid or the battle mat.
I find that depending on your DM, that sort of abstraction can either be an enormous power boost or just a completely nullifying force for a spell like that. More often than not, I feel like when you actually plot it out on a battle map, which tend to be fairly open and spacious, spells like that are pretty useless unless you have a really killer choke point or something to use them with. But when it comes down to the DM's own envisioning of the battlefield, that's when you kind of run into a case-by-case situation.
Something I have experimented with that I think has promise, even though it is flawed, is taking elements of the abstraction from Fate, which listeners of the Eldritch Lorecast will be familiar with because of our Christmas game. But I've taken elements from Fate and kind of plugged them into combat from time to time. I ran a combat where I just kind of, I had these cards that kind of represented areas, and you say, these bad guys are over here, these bad guys are over here, and you can put whatever you're using to represent your players on those cards, right? And they can move between them with their movement. You can sort of generally on the table without a map give an impression of distance, give an impression of what is where, without having to get super detailed with it. And I found that to be quite useful.
Just to quickly answer your earlier question, Dael, I have a friend who plays in our D&D campaign who, as a player, and he bases his entire characters around the miniatures that he has in his collection. So instead of going, I want to play a fighter who is an archer or whatever, he'll go through his collection and be like, oh, I see I have this fighter with this big sword here. Well, I'm going to make a character around this, this particular miniature. And it goes so far. He was playing a gunslinger, so he had this miniature with like a musket and a black jacket that was on it. And during the course of the campaign, he just happened to find a magical jacket that was like a red jacket, and it was kind of like a jacket of persuasion. So he went and repainted the jacket on the miniature red. Or he had a kobold that used, I can't remember what its original weapon was. I think it was like an axe or something like that, but it was this little kobold mini with an axe. It was absolutely adorable. And halfway through the campaign, it got a magic hammer, or a hammer it believed was magical because it had heat metal cast on it one time. So he cut off the head of the weapon and glued a hammer on instead. So he kind of upkeeps his miniatures through the campaign. Yeah, exactly. And on the DM side of things, I kind of do similar things where I had to catch myself once because I was going through eBay looking for old Warhammer Fantasy Wood Elves, because I wanted Wood Elves to be like a main antagonist in a campaign that I was running. These really Witcher-esque, Squire Tell style Wood Elves that real guerrilla fighters. And I have so many goblins with bows that would have worked perfectly as miniatures instead, but I had to have wood elves specifically. Yeah. So I can get quite specific and design campaigns or encounters around a miniature rather than a monster or a stat block, adjust the stat block to be like, oh, this monster has, I see, like this spike on the end of its tail, but the stat block doesn't have a tail attack. So I'm going to put a tail attack in it so that this miniature is better represented on the table. So
the lengths to which some people will go to have the exact right mini. I wrote an Adventures League adventure with a two-headed red-furred demon goat. And there was no mini that I was aware of. I
think I played that one.
I just did that. And I started getting pictures of people who created their own. They would take a goat mini, cut a head off of the second one, melt it on, and then paint it red. And there were these homemade two-headed red-furred demon goats out there. And, more power to you. I'm sure those players who played that got a lot out of that, seeing the care that went into it and seeing the actual physical representation of such a creature. So I love people that love minis and love to bring that sort of power to the game for their players.
Yeah, you can't do that with a 2D standee.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, unless you make your own 2D standee. Especially for specific monsters like that, something that is quite unique, having the miniature represented on the table. I bemoaned a moment ago that my frog monster got killed within a really quick amount of time, and then he's off the table and never again shall he see the light of day. But on the flip side, having that centerpiece miniature, whether it's a dragon, a two-headed goat monster, or something else that's quite specific, at the center of your campaign, trundle onto the battlefield in all its fully painted glory, definitely has a sense of pride for the campaign feels like it's reached a climax as the game master when you can throw a fully painted miniature into the climactic battle. So
man, sometimes it's not even for miniatures. My recent home games have taken place at my sibling's house, which is some 300 miles away from my home. And so it's always a big road trip adventure to get my group down there. And one of the dragons in my collection I mentioned earlier, the black dragon miniature, is a miniature I've been saving for a long time for this one particular demon dragon to show up in the campaign. And I brought it all the way down there, fully knowing that she was going to appear, but not even in a combat encounter, just kind of like be there.
Yeah.
And the value of just being able to plonk a Gigantor miniature onto the table, even if it's not for a combat, is just indescribable. That dragon was on the field for, I don't know, 5 minutes maybe, not even for a combat. And I tailed it in my backpack, wrapped up in a t-shirt for some 300 miles, but it was worth it, damn it. It was worth the space in my luggage.
For people who do like minis and sort of kit bashing minis, I recommend checking out. There's a collaboration that's called, I do think it's called the Monster Bash, but I'm confusing myself because that also was the name of a computer game that my siblings and I played a lot as children. So maybe I'm confusing myself. It was a Monster Bash. We used to sing that every time. But there's Mizcast and Rackrex Art and a bunch of other people sort of designed this collaboration where they just get a bunch of crafters and artists and all sorts of cool creative people together, and they each create little bits of a monster, and they go together in a deck of cards, and then everyone draws like 6 cards or 7 cards or something, and you have to make a monster out of your randomized collection of stuff. And they make some of the most incredible things you wouldn't believe, so definitely look that up.
I mean, there's so many YouTube tutorials and different styles of how to paint and so many new skills that you can learn when painting. Not to mention, I know a YouTube channel called Tabletop Witchcraft, which do terrain and spell effects. And that's a whole nother, rabbit hole to fall down, where you can spend hours constructing your own dungeons or towers or, dome effects for your spells or whatever it happens to be. So
yeah, I really want to recommend a YouTube channel of a colleague of mine. Her name's V Musée, who does miniature painting and custom sculpting and stuff like that. And her work is just incredible. She worked for Wizkids for a while. I don't think she does anymore, but her level of artistry is inspiring. If you're looking to get into mini painting, there are far worse places to start than V, the crafting muse, and her channel.
Well, speaking of miniatures, that was not a miniature discussion, but this next one, maybe.
That's a pretty good one, actually.
Yeah,
That's
you
pretty
like
good.
that? Yeah. We got a couple of listener emails in over the past couple weeks, and this first one coming in from Leon. Leon has a pretty simple question. They were listening to an earlier episode where we talked about level up and whether it's better to use XP or milestone. They described that in their game, they let the players choose when to level up themselves, and said that the first couple times it was a little bit hasty. It was like, yeah, let's level up, but found that as they continued to play, the players kind of took more and more responsibility for the feeling of like, we haven't really accomplished anything. Level up right now doesn't quite feel right. Let's wait till we get a little bit further through the campaign. Is this the sort of responsibility you feel you could trust to hand over to your players for them to choose when they level up?
It's a really interesting system that I don't think I've ever heard anyone else ever using before.
No, me neither.
I think any sort of social contract thing like that really comes down to the people you're playing with. I don't think I would ever feel comfortable, writing a role-playing game that way.
Right. Unless
it was really, really specific. I don't know. I think it could work for your group if your group works like that.
Just quickly, I thought you were going to say then, James, I don't know if I would trust my group of friends to be able to level up that way.
Bunch of thieving bastards, a lot of them. They'll take every scrap I give them.
What about you, Shawn?
Here's a funny little... Yeah, this is a funny little story from the precursor to the Adventurers League in 3rd edition D&D was Living Greyhawk. And so it was a campaign where, like the Adventurers League, you play and you level and you can go from table to table. And there was such a rush to level. People would just go out of their way to do the thing that they knew would get them the most experience points and play the certain adventures that had more. And they rushed and rushed and rushed to level. And their reward for that was not being able to play their character anymore because there were no more adventures of the level that they became to play. So then people started to figure out ways to not level. So at 3rd edition, if you multi-classed in 3rd edition and you got out of balance with the levels, you had an experience point penalty via the rules. So if you were like a 10th level cleric, but only like a 3rd level fighter, you got a 10% or 20% reduction in experience points. So people then figured out that if they leveled just right, they could actually play a game where they had such a penalty to their experience point gain that they would not gain any experience points and therefore would never level, but still gain magic items and gold and so on and so on and so on. So if you leave it to players as a whole, they will usually, A, make bad choices until they figure out that they are making bad choices. And then they will make even worse choices to try to game the system. If you're talking about your specific home game group, I think that as James said, it makes perfect sense that they know the pace they want to go at. As long as you make the story that you're sharing with them, that you're sharing with each other, match their level, then great, do it that way. Adventures League now does something very similar in many of its campaigns, where you play an adventure. If you want to level, you level. If you don't want to level, you don't have to. You can stay at the level you like, and you can play any of the adventures that come in whatever series or story that you're creating for your character. And people tend to do the thing that they want to do. As soon as you take any sort of reward or some sort of trick out of the equation where they're trying to fool a system or trying to get one over on someone else, people will do what they want to do and makes them happy. As long as the system can accommodate that, great, do that. I'm
still reeling over the most apropos use of the word min-max that I've ever thought of in my entire life. That's an incredible story.
Now that's max minning. That's
that's right. Max minning right there.
That's minning. It's bizarre but true.
I mean, this is something I might try in the campaign I'm running at the moment, because based on, I think, the earlier discussions that we had, my player characters are currently level 2, and we're trying a thing which I'm calling Quest to Level 3, which is basically where they won't all reach Level 3 at the same time. They'll reach it at story-appropriate moments. In theory, they could have done it like the session after they reached Level 2, or it might be 5 sessions, or however long it ends up taking. But I'm thinking, in the context of this discussion, of handing that fully over to them, instead of being like, all right, well, let's work on a quest that you can go and do together, whether it's to go take your paladin vows in the woods, or whether it's go to, go train with a rogue or a knight who can teach you what you need about what you need to know about your subclass. Is just hand it over to the players fully and just be like, you tell me when you level up. When do you feel like your character has learned enough to specialize in what it is they're going to specialize in? And I think from there, I would probably flip back to milestone, depending on how it goes. But level 3 specifically for me, for a lot of classes, not every class, but for a lot of classes, is that big level up where there's a change in character. Their character has to make a decision or a commitment to something to be able to reach that next level.
Yeah, that's a good fit. That's form and content working together to create meaning, baby. I think this is one of those ideas where I'm like, yes, this is a good idea. I see the logic of it. I can see how it will work for some people and not for other people. And I think that people should consider giving it a go. I myself will never do it. But that's because I'm the kind of DM who every time someone's like, just, delegate, hand your players some of the stuff, hand them the monster's hit points. And I'm always like, that's a great idea. No.
Yeah.
It's just because I'm a little bit of a control freak. I like having the whole system of dials in front of me to play with. And I don't want anyone else controlling it. That's me. It's like when someone is the driver and they don't want anyone messing with their air conditioning or their music.
The radio.
Yeah, that's me, but D&D.
Well, I agree. In the run sheet for this episode, to kind of expand this discussion, I was like, what other responsibilities do you hand over to the players in terms of the monster's hit points or the initiative order or, even the music? Do you give somebody else the access to the Spotify playlist and then they can kind of DJ the session themselves?
Excellent ideas that I will never take on board.
I don't think I will either. For me, it's a matter of wanting to create, and maybe maybe this is a bit foolish, but wanting to create like a simulation feel or like a real story first feel where the numbers are as hidden as possible to help the story feel as immersive as possible is the theory behind it. I'm not sure how super effective it is, but it's not like the monster has a bar of hit points that is slowly going down. It's, you can see it taking damage. You can tell you're wearing it down. You can tell, one of my famous phrases being a light breeze would push it over because it's so hurt now. Now my players are going, what strength of breeze would it take to push this thing over roughly? Strong breeze, light breeze, where are we looking?
Is consulting their spell list. Like, when do you say slight breeze?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I don't hand hit points over. I keep the initiative order hidden. I know that after the first round of combat, the players can just figure it out. Like, that's fine. But for at least that first round, I like it to be hidden so that they don't know when the monster's going to jump in and get its turn. So I don't think I would hand a lot of responsibility over. But what about you, James? Are you someone who likes to take some of that off your plate?
I like to craft an experience when I'm playing D&D. And that comes down to the selection of maps and minis for one thing and music for another. I don't think I would be opposed to handing hit points from monsters or initiative order over to players. I don't do it because that's the way I sort of was raised playing the game, and it works fine for me. And it's not a big load on my brain. I just took damage. Duh, there it goes. And I feel like my players are reasonably uninvested for the most part in the play-by-play of the math. I've got one player who I think would be. But it's just easier, I think, for me to be the one to do that because I'm the most experienced player. I've been playing D&D the longest. I know what my system is like. And they all seem to like it that way. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Shawn, what's broken your game that you can give the players to fix, or is nothing broken?
Bold of you to assume anything is broken Shawn's game.
I don't know.
I start the players themselves are broken to start with, so that's
so
useful.
Nothing gets given to
No,
them.
it's
brutal.
For the longest time, I was sort of the similar vein of, I'm going to take control of everything, and the game is going to go more smoothly because of it. Then as I played more and played with more and different DMs, I began to see through both really good game masters and really bad game masters that there might be some room for players to help. So as I'm playing, I would say, would you like me to keep initiative for you? Game master? Because we're like in a half hour, the first half hour of a battle that's in no way looking like it's going to end because we keep losing initiative. So why don't you let me do that? And so, over time I've experimented both as a game master and a player with letting players do things. And again, this comes from experience at conventions, running 8 or 9 tables over the weekend of many different types of players or many different types of game masters when I get a chance to play, that you learn some tricks that work for some players and don't work for others. Having them draw the map can be fun if you're doing some sort of exploration thing, or not if you're in a hurry and you just need to get the map done. Anything could be fun for certain players, but for the most part, if you know what you're doing, and especially if your players need to focus more on what they're doing with their characters, then it's best not to give them too much responsibility. But if you can see someone's getting bored, I would rather give them something to do, even if it's less smooth of a game then, because then at least they're engaged because they're keeping track of something.
Yeah.
I also think it's worth saying, I can't wait until I mellow out enough as a DM to just hand stuff off to my players. I think that'll be a great day for me.
I'm kind of the same. Like, I handed over to my players once because I heard this and I thought it was great advice to get them to do the session recap. and be like, all right, what happened last session? And no offense to my players, they were terrible at it. They it wasn't just a, this is my personal taste sort of thing. It was, they couldn't remember, or they were like, what was the name of that guy? Or who were we talking to? Or why was this relevant? And I was like, okay, I think I need to do this, because for me, the session recap is kind of putting the players back into the game. It's like, all right, where we were with our last session was you were going up this street and there were all these things, rather than kind of being this meandering, maybe this happened. Not saying that's what my players sounded like. So yeah, I think I'm a bit of the same Dael, where I feel like a bit of a control freak, but
and you want that to be like previously on Grim Hollow.
One of the useful things that you can do, letting the recap happen by the players, is it's a tool that you can use to see what they remember, because what they remember can then tell you what they're focused on. So if they're talking about this NPC and completely forgetting about this great detail of something that happened in the combat, you might want to then focus, either give them more NPCs to interact with because that's what they like, or step up your game in terms of the combat to make it more memorable, so they remember this detail of, we did this whole combat because we needed to get this gem that was being used in the ritual, and they completely forget that part of it. Then that who your players are and how you can then adjust your game. And recaps are also good if the players are getting sick of hearing you talk. It's sometimes good to hand that over, give a different point of view of, instead of hearing again your history of your city, we'll let somebody else tell it. Maybe they won't even get it exactly right. I can always correct them, but I can't say the same thing over and over and over again while people's eyes are rolling up in their head. Letting someone else tell it brings a little different perspective.
I like to tell these recaps myself because, a combination of stuff that's been said already, but also because it's an effective way of saying, hey, we're playing D&D now. If players are ever a little bit like, oh, I don't know what to do, I don't want to be the first one to say something and look like a fool, then I'll be like, okay, well, shall we play some D&D? Here's what's happened last time. Based on that information, what do you want to do?
Sure.
And then all of a sudden they know what their present circumstances are, and suddenly they've been thinking about their character and their experiences that character was thinking of in the last session. And all of a sudden it's a very smooth start to the session. Though I will say the tag of that's what happened last time, what do you want to do now, is a very important part of that, because otherwise you'll hit the end of your recap, and unless there's a player who's really raring to go, which you might have a player like that in your group, then sometimes people will just kind of be waiting for an invitation. They'll just be sitting around.
I think that's a good bit of advice, that last bit in particular, because I struggle with the session recap. My players, I love you. I know that it might feel like I'm bashing you this episode. I promise I'm not. But I do struggle with that. It's time to play now, and everybody's still getting their dinner or getting up to get a drink or like moving around or still having a conversation. And I think that what I'm missing is maybe that exact like little link of like, here's what happened last time, ba-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da, and that's what happened. And then there's almost like another gap before the session starts proper. So having just that little link, I think, might help kind of really pull them in.
Ben, I figured out your problem. Your recaps are just ba-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da. No wonder they...
Yeah, I'm just not saying words. That's the problem. Look, I try to interpretively, like, give them the tone. Ba-da-ba-da-ba-da, ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da, ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da, and they're like, oh yeah, that guy.
When Sims play D&D.
That's what it's like at my table. Speaking of what it's like at my table... we got another email from David, who's talking about campaign tone and setting. David is transitioning. Typically, they run like a horror-style campaign and are transitioning into running a campaign that's more technologically driven, kind of explorative Conan-style adventure. And are wondering, I think we've spoken about this sort of in earlier episodes of the Eldritch Lorecast, but maybe it's worth quickly revisiting. What you do while running the game, both kind of, in the game itself with the mechanics of the game, but I'm also thinking, ancillary to the actual game itself in terms of atmosphere. James, you've talked a bit about how you like to play music and really, have a whole room kind of ambience to the sessions, to achieve specific tones in your game, and how you might go about changing that up if the theme or the atmosphere or the genre of your campaign were to change.
That's the magic word.
I've said it now.
Genre. I have a lot of thoughts on this, if I may.
Yeah,
I will. Because, look, here's the thing. I never shut up about this. People who watch my YouTube channel, people who've read my articles for Ghostfire, this is the thing that I will never stop banging on about. So let's talk about genre theory. Hans Jaus, who was a medievalist scholar, talks about the horizon of expectation.
Just so many so many volumes being turned down, or so many fuzz going on in people's heads. Like, this is my
I love
recap.
your academia. Please.
I did a guest lecture on this. It's the only thing I know. So Hans Jaus was a medievalist scholar, and he talks about, but he also talks about genre, and he talks about this thing called the horizon of expectation, which is basically, when you come into a text, whether it be a book or a TV show or whatever, you have certain expectations of that genre. Brian Atterbury, in his book Strategies of Fantasy, also talks about this in terms of fuzzy set theory, which is basically saying that genre is not a clearly defined, fantasy must include this, this, and this, right? It's got sort of a center to it, which is much more clearly defined, which for fantasy is typically Lord of the Rings, right? That's kind of the genre-defining text that we build out from, right? And you have certain elements of that, like elves and dwarves, that you expect. So it kind of works in reverse as well. Can you tell I'm trying to get through this quickly? If you see elves and dwarves in something, you're probably going to go, oh, so this is fantasy, right? You're not going to look at elves and dwarves and go, this must be a sci-fi horror. That's not really a thing. So you have kind of things that are central to the concept, but then as you build out and as you get into subgenres like dark fantasy, low fantasy, urban fantasy, it starts changing what that horizon of expectations looks like. And so you end up with this thing, and this is what Hans Jaus says. He says that meeting generic expectations is sort of this key element of enjoyment, but also the horizon of change, where you go against those generic expectations, are also central to enjoyment. It's something that has been present from mythology to Shakespeare to fan fiction, where you have these tropes that pop up that you know how to read, you recognize them, and you derive pleasure from those things, and being able to tell that guy's going to be the murderer because he's a more famous actor than any of the other extras, right? There's pleasure in that, but there is also pleasure in having those expectations flipped on you, and suddenly things change. And the reason I bring all of this up is because setting tone, setting genre, I mean, first thing you can do is tell your players, we're going to play something that's less horror, more technology now. That's handy and good. Because there is pleasure in playing into those expectations. As someone who is creating the characters, you want to buy into it. If you're setting up this town's going on a witch hunt and they're accusing this woman of being a witch, your players kind of want to get into that. They kind of want to go, I've seen Hansel and Gretel witch hunters. I know that this person's going to be innocent, right? And there's that drive to play into the story, to want to tell that story, so they'll go for it. But you can also find little places to tweak it along the way. But I'm just saying, basically, look at what genre you're telling. Pay attention to the story and the important beats for telling that kind of a story, I think is super key to making a good tone for your D&D game.
You're not going to believe this, but I was literally talking about this today. I didn't, not the academia side, but what you said, you said it so much smarter than I was saying it, that I wish I had heard you first and then I could sound smart. But for me, it's all of that, right? It's all the tropes and then all the changes. But how is the story then moving forward within those? Because I look at Greyhawk, which is an old D&D setting, and the Forgotten Realms, which is an old and also new D&D setting, and Eberron, which is a different setting, and you can pinpoint all these little differences. But if you tell the same story within those settings, you are really discounting what you could be doing, the differences you could be showing in your narrative. Because while there is a glean of difference, some of the underpinnings are the same. So in Eberron, you have the dragon-marked houses. Really cool idea, really interesting things. But if in your story, those dragon-marked houses end up becoming the same thing that the Zentarum or that the Harpers are in the Forgotten Realms, or the same thing that is in Greyhawk, then all of those subtle little changes don't really mean anything, because you're still telling the same sort of high magic, high fantasy story. The details end up not mattering to the structure of the story. And so that's why you have to really, really lean hard into making those underpinnings different. You can't just go to the tavern to rest because there are no taverns, or the taverns aren't safe, even though there may be taverns. That's the place where the story and the genre and the tone need to be changed so dramatically that the players will recognize, all right, this is different than what I would do if I was in Waterdeep, because I'm not safe in my own bedroom.
And it makes a huge difference, right? Like I used an example in a video once where I was talking about, if you're in a horror story and there's a lot of characters, you know that most of those characters aren't going to survive. Maybe one or two of them will survive. If you're in fantasy and there's a lot of characters, you know that maybe one or two of them is going to die. That's a huge difference between genres. And, you know, it's like Shawn is saying, you look for those like hallmark differences and kind of pin stuff around them.
I think it's also, for me, you know, what Shawn was saying reminds me of my mild frustration with playing D&D with kind of a mixed bag group of a lot of strangers. Is everybody wants to bring their own thing to it, and they want to, you know, this person wants to play you know, it's a bit of a trope or a meme now, but this person's playing their parents are dead paladin who's on a quest for revenge, and this person's playing an Aarakocra who has, like, you know, a laser gun or something like that, and there's this mismatched kind of element of expectations. And I think that the way that 5e is published, with, you know, all these books kind of coming out, there's not a lot of templating, I don't think, to my perception, especially for new players, in terms of what exists in this setting. You know, like, do Warforged from Eberron exist in Faerun? And I think I'm not an expert on either of those settings, but I think the answer is no. But a Warforged doesn't feel out of place in Faerun because it's kind of become the everything setting. And when you have everything in a setting, it can be really hard to try to capture a specific genre or tone or theme. And for me, you know, I always come back to theme. What's the story you're telling really about? Which is, you know, not always important to a D&D game if you're just playing a game and you just want escapism and to have fun with your friends. But, you know, the themes between horror or dark fantasy and, you know, Conan-esque technological exploration fantasy are very different between, you know, might is right in some capacity in dark fantasy, or often evil things happen when good people aren't strong enough to defeat them, or, you know, beware of the dark because what lurks within it is worse. I think that's a tagline for the Monster Grimoire. Whereas, you know, technological, if you're talking about technology, it's like, is this making us safer, or is this making the world more dangerous? Is the technology advancing too quickly, and how is it changing societies, you know? And if you look at trying to introduce these themes into your campaign, then the atmosphere may kind of change, not on its own, but, you know, it's all kind of tied together. Does it make sense?
Yes.
Practical things that you can do is just be like, all right, we're changing from dark fantasy to this. I'm going to allow Warforged now in this campaign because we're talking about technology where I might not have in the horror dark fantasy campaign. Let's get some artificers in there. You can play an artificer where there was previously, I strayed away from it. But I'm going to take this option off the table.
Give your players a palette to work with, right? Like if you're going, okay, humans absorb art, right? We absorb entertainment, we absorb stories, we absorb art. And so when you are saying we're going to move on to this technological exploration Conan-esque game, you probably have in your head a couple of different texts like movies or video games that you're going to be drawing from. Tell your players that, because that gets them on the same page. They go, oh yeah, I know that game. I can do something that's related to that game. And then they just, it just fits in better. They get it's a great way of communicating because humans all have this natural tendency to just pull that information in.
Speaking of genre and stories, this story is at an end because we are over time, which is a shame because the next email I had racked up actually linked well into this conversation, but it's going to need to wait until next week. If you have a question for us, if you have a topic that you want us to mull over and pull apart and then put back together in this new form. I don't know. I was coming up with some analogy there that fell apart. Email podcast@ghostfiregaming.com where I receive the emails. I read them all and we'll pick some of them each week to present to our panel of hosts here. Or you can reach out to us on Twitter. Our handles are just below our names. So you can reach out, keep the conversation going there. Talk with your friends about the Eldritch Lorecast. Like, subscribe, all that good YouTube-y stuff. And if you're listening on a audio platform, leave a review or a whatever. Stars. We like stars. Stars are good. We hoard them like dragon's treasure. Anyway, my name's Ben Byrne. I'm here with James Hake, Dael Kingsmill, Shawn Merwin. And until next week, we will see you then.